Well, folks, here we are again for the weekend forecast. And before we get to that main forecast, of course, this last week we did see some slightly cooler conditions during the first half of the week in response to a cold front that moved into the region during the weekend that also helped generate some scattered isolated thunderstorms across south central, southwest, southeast, and portions of the panhandle, and some very heavy precipitation in some small little pockets of the southwest where we had close to 3 inches in a few isolated locations. Also seen that in the extreme southeastern corner, but for the most part everybody was high and dry, and because of that and because of the warmth, we have seen the entire state now been upgraded to at least moderate drought conditions, with severe drought conditions very common across the western half of the state. And so as we go forward in time, of course, the main concern is with corn being actively in the pollination stage, what will the impacts of this heat and dryness have? We're going to have to wait and see, but overall the current forecast for this next week doesn't look very promising in terms of the pollination of the crop. And so we would expect to see further degradation in some of the areas of eastern Nebraska, particularly in the dryland cropping zones. Now let's take a look at the upper air models and see what we can expect across Nebraska and points to our east. In reference to the corn crop, we're seeing a high pressure system that's starting to build back in response to the cold front that came through over the last 24 hours. It's now going to move back toward the Great Lakes in the form of a warm front, and that's going to bring warmer air into our region. So we're going to be looking at highs in the northeast, looking at the low 90s for highs in the southwest. We may make it to 105, but we should certainly get over the century mark. There may be some scattered thunderstorms that develop across eastern Nebraska during the first half of the day, but it looks like most of those chances will move out of the region as the day progresses. Now as we go into Sunday, very warm conditions as the ridge builds east. We'll be looking at highs in the upper 90s east to around 105 in portions of western Nebraska. As we go into Monday, pretty much the same thing. The high does shift a little bit toward our southeast. We're going to see highs again in the upper 90s across eastern Nebraska with maybe even an isolated 100-degree plus mark. As we get into southwest Nebraska, the same old song and dance. 100 to 105 looks to be the trend. Now as we go into Tuesday, we're going to see that ridge tries to flatten at the top in response to a trough coming over top of it. And so we may see a little bit cooler conditions as the day progresses, particularly as we get into the afternoon hours. We're looking at highs that are going to be somewhere in the mid to upper 90s across the north, with 100 to 105 across south central southwest Nebraska, and isolated thunderstorms developing during the afternoon and possibly carrying off into the day on Wednesday as we see a little bit cooler air with a surface cold front trying to make its way into the state. So we'll be looking at highs in the low 90s across the north to the upper 90s across the southwest. Now by the time we get to Thursday, we're going to see pretty much similar conditions, but we'll also see that cold front start to lift back as a warm front. So there may be some chance for some scattered thunderstorm activity across northern Nebraska, less so across southern Nebraska. We're looking at highs in the northeast around the low 90s. Again, we'll be looking at the upper 90s across the southwest, and by the time we get to Friday, the ridge tries to start to make its way back in. We'll be looking at highs in the low 90s northeast to possibly 100 to 105 across the southwest. 8 to 14-day forecast continues the warm trend across the northern plains. In terms of precipitation, unfortunately, it looks like the dry conditions for the western corn belt will continue into the foreseeable future.